Good morning, everybody. Happy Monday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. Lots of big stories breaking this morning. And also, by the way, guys, nice to be back. Hope everybody had a lovely Thanksgiving. So mass protests all across China. We will tell you everything we know about that and what the fallout from that could ultimately be. This is mostly around their continued insane COVID-0 authoritarian policies. So we will break that down for you. Also, all the latest about Trump's dinner companions, Nick Fuentes, Kanye West, and Milo. Yeah. Oh my God, it's a whole thing. We have to talk about it. And also, interestingly, who is saying anything about it on the Republican side, who is not? That's maybe the most revealing part of all of this. Trump doing insane shit at this point is no real surprise. Also, the very latest out of Ukraine, where winter is setting in and blackouts are roiling that country. It is, it's a very disturbing and distressing situation there. We also have some news with regards to Venezuela and oil. This one has been a long time coming. What is that going to mean in terms of your price at the pump? And we also got a little fun Taylor Lorenz update for you. Yes. Her reaction to everything going on in China is really quite something. We also have our own little news about FIFA and
we had a little episode with that.
Little issue with FIFA coming directly from us.
With that, let's get to the show and with China. Some really just remarkable stuff coming out of China that was sparked, it seems, by a fire in Xinjiang. So let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. Protests have erupted now across the entire country, but appear to have originated over anger of what happened in, and I apologize for my pronunciation throughout this entire show, ERUPT. I do not speak fluent Turkic. Apologies for that. Now, there was the fire in Xinjiang's capital in an apartment building after 14 people were killed and appeared to have difficulty exiting the building. The reason why this connects to the COVID lockdowns is that across Chinese social media, WeChat and elsewhere, there were videos circulating and immediate speculation that, and I did not even know to the extent of what zero COVID means there beyond the insanity that we did. Krystal, if you are living on an apartment block where there's somebody who's tested positive for COVID, not only do they lock you down, they actually put barricades up in the staircases and to prevent you from actually leaving the apartment. So whenever a fire breaks out in a shoddily constructed apartment building, people die because they literally can't get out. And of course, it's a very crowded country. Anyway, this hit a nerve across the entire country, sparking protests really, both in some of the major cities in Beijing and in Shanghai has been some of the major areas of protest. Shanghai in particular, the reason why it matters is because protesters were actually gathering on a street called ERUPT Street, which is named after the capital in Xinjiang. Is kind of like a one China policy, and protesters gathered there shouting, "End the lockdown." Just widespread anger. Even some Chinese citizens speaking to Western journalists on the street. I think it's important here that we parse what's going on. Is this like an uprising against Chinese socialism? No, this really is an uprising against zero COVID. Also, because it's China, we have very limited view into how widespread these are, what they are, the level of support they have within the domestic populace. What we can say is that several thousand people do appear to have had completely enough with being locked down and an ongoing commitment by the CCP to zero COVID. They have not issued any public statement either against, for, or listening to the protesters as of yet so far. And we're going to go into a little bit into what their expected response will be.
Yeah, and so as always, when we cover international protests, especially in countries that are repressive and where you don't have, total freedom of the press, it's very hard to tell exactly, like you said, how widespread, how significant, how much of the population supports this sentiment, what does it mean, how much of a threat does it really represent for the government in power. So all of those caveats on the table. Financial Times has a piece out this morning talking about what makes these protests different, because it's not like there's been zero protest in China. But typically, it's been limited to a single local issue. Right. So maybe like working conditions at one factory. What makes this different is that you have a sort of uniting national cause, and you have protests that are spreading across regions, all the way across China. And that's what really makes this quite significant and quite different than what we have ultimately seen in the past. By the way, some of these protests have already borne fruit. You had some places where people heard that there were COVID lockdowns that were coming into place. They protested, they went to their local government, and some of those things got rolled back. Right. So it shows you that even in an authoritarian country, you still have to worry about the social contract that you have with your domestic populace. And right now, that seems to be very, very frayed. The other context here, and we can put this next piece up on the screen, why now? Why did this spark of the apartment fire and the deaths there from people who are trapped inside because of zero COVID? Why is this really touching such a nerve across the country? And it really is because you now have another surge of COVID cases. So people are looking again at like, my God, we're going to go back to these incredibly stringent authoritarian restrictions and total lockdown. And so I think that's part of the important context of why right now. They say that, confrontations have already erupted in a few locations. You had at a Foxconn plant in central China that makes the world's iPhones. There were confrontations there, and then it has spread across the country. Part of the issue here, Saagar, as we've covered before, only 40% of Chinese citizens over the age of 80 have received a booster shot. And the vaccines, the Sinovac made in China vaccine, less effective than some of the international mRNA vaccines, but as like a matter of national pride, they don't want to go to the international market. They don't have the levels of natural immunity that other countries around the world do. And so they really are in this sort of disastrous situation because of choices they've made all the way along, that if they did totally open up, they have a very vulnerable elderly population that could be hit really hard and die in large numbers if they did just say like, we just got to open the gates.
China played itself on multiple levels. They were committed to zero COVID, even in the face of Omicron, where it's effectively impossible to do so. They've had been an effective case now there for a year. Now, before that, they were still committed to total lockdown. They didn't encourage mass vaccine uptake. Also, it appears that a lot of the Chinese population, because they actually believed the CCP, were like, I'm not going to get vaccinated. I don't need protection because the Chinese government has got this. So now they're dealing with a variant, 1,000 times more. At this point, I don't even know what variant is circulating. But the point is that it's nearly impossible to circumvent this in any way. And what they point to is that at this point, given the fact that you have vaccine scheduling that takes like a month or so out from that period, what are you going to do? You can't just, in the face of surging infections, especially with Omicron, it's going to go much faster than any of your capacity to mass vaccinate the population. Almost 2/3, like you were saying, the elderly and of people 60 plus have not taken the vaccine or even a booster. And look, we've always said on the show, it's like, look, if you are in a vulnerable population, you should consider it. And over there, they're actually giving them the option, which is you should stay home and stay locked down. But that is having massive impacts on the total society. I do also think it's important. Let's take this out of COVID, because at this point, I don't even know if this is about COVID anymore. I think, and what I have read so far, is that the oppression is the point. Zero COVID is the opportunity for the CCP to install cameras in every house that they want to, in every shop, to have QR codes, to keep total and complete track of every single Chinese citizen, wherever they are, what they're doing, their access to work. It has become like the worst of the authoritarian nightmares that we could even dream of here in the US. And look, in China, there has long been a social contract, which is you accept like deep political repression, but we make you rich in the process. And so the problem, though, is that zero COVID is now really implicating that trade-off at a very basic level, because people are not getting rich. They're not only curtailing their social life, a lot of people are suffering economically. Also, we covered, remember the Shanghai lockdowns just a couple of months ago? People were going without food, straight up. I mean, they were literally unable to get food. So the most basic elements of Chinese society are beginning to chafe, but no signs yet that the CCP is like willing to give in any way.
And the indications are that these protests really are among a broad swath of groups. It's students, it's laborers, it's all kinds of people who are participating in these protests. And I think what you said makes a lot of sense just in light of the fact, our experience here, which you never want to project onto the rest of the world, but seems to be sort of a global phenomenon, is COVID was just an accelerant.
Yeah.
Like the trends that were already in place, the breakdowns in the social contract that were already starting to come apart. COVID was an accelerant, and COVID revealed a lot. And so I can imagine in that context, it was also obviously an accelerant of the surveillance state, an accelerant of this sort of like brutal police state crackdown. And so while the core issue here, I mean, they definitely are chanting about COVID, they're talking about COVID zero, like that clearly is the impetus, the apartment fire, which it appears those deaths were caused by zero COVID lockdown procedures. That is definitely the spark, but I do think that is the sort of like deeper level concern that has to be, the most the most concerning for the regime in power.
Yeah, so let's go. We have a montage of photos, videos from across the entire country. So these are all photos that we've been able to gather. This one is in Shanghai in particular. And while you're watching, what you can see there is that police, just basically in a line trying to keep people away. Everyone is showing blank pieces of paper, both as a protest against censorship and against the lockdown. It's become, at least in the last couple of days, one of the universal ways that people are showing their discontent. While we play those photos, I'll just list off some of the cities. There's 10 confirmed cities across the entire country: Shanghai, Beijing, Wuhan, Chengdu, all massive cities, tens of millions of people who live there, all having widespread protests. There are several other cities where this has gone ahead and broke down. Now, what we also see, Krystal, is that the Beijing government is asking universities to send students home, quote, as soon as possible to quell further dissent on campuses. This is a longstanding fear that universities represent kind of the epicenter of protest, especially with the scar of Tiananmen Square. So right now you have Tsinghua and Peking University, some of the most prestigious universities in the entire country, who have hundreds of protests, who are actually staging peaceful demonstrations there on campus. They are doing their best to empty those universities as soon as possible. And I just want to again caveat, which is at this point with China, we just do not have a lot of good information except in the massive urban centers where there are, of course, Westerners who are living. Outside of that, to what extent this is a phenomenon in the rest of rural China where information and all of that is very tightly controlled, it's pure speculation. We just genuinely have no idea.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, the context, as we've also covered here, is of course Xi just appointed himself president for life. Yeah. Appointed a bunch of really hardline loyalists, including as premier of the country. So the number 2 person was the dude who was in charge of the most stringent Shanghai lockdown procedures. And so, for a while at the beginning of the pandemic, like we were looking at envy at some of their cities which had been able to open up because they had these incredibly strict, onerous lockdown procedures in the places where you had hotspots. And that's when you had a variant that was somewhat more containable. Now, so it was like, okay, well, we can sort of like force a minority of the population to have to deal with this horrific temporary lifestyle so that the rest of the country can open up and do whatever we want.
Right.
Now, because the variants are so hard to contain and because they are so infectious, you now have a bulk of the population that is potentially subject to these lockdown procedures. So I think that's part of what has flipped as well, is you can no longer look at it as like, okay, let's just contain the problem over here and the rest of us can go on living our lives. It's like, no, nobody can go on living their lives. We are all a day or an hour or a week away from being locked into our apartments again and worrying about whether we have enough food to eat.
Right, especially more than 2 years later.
Hey guys, ready or not, 2024 is fully upon us now, and Saagar and I have been brainstorming ways that we can really up our game for this critical election.
Yeah, we rely on our premium subs to expand our coverage, to add staff, to upgrade the studio. We just want to give you the best independent coverage of this election, which is possible. So if you can help us out, become a premium subscriber today, breakingpoints.com, or the link is down here in the description video. It really means the world to us, and if you like what we're all about, this is the best possible way to keep us 100% independent, working only for you.